There's a beautiful scene in the documentary on Marlene Dumas. Inside a studio, Dumas is dressed in black. She takes a large sheet of watercolor paper, lays it on the ground, sits on a wooden bench, places her face in the palm of her hand, and sighs. A sudden change of frame. Now Dumas is at work. She's holding her brush between her fingers, suspended as if waiting for an order, for an idea. But most importantly, she's kneeling on the ground and over the sheet, almost throwing herself onto it. This shot is proof of something that you can see in paintings such as Intoxication or Magdalene, while walking past them on the first floor of Palazzo Grassi. The relationship between Marlene Dumas and her subjects isn't cerebral as it is promiscuous. It doesn't matter if she's depicting a child, a stripper in a peep show, or the director and writer Pierpaolo Pasolini. The relationship is a struggle where loyalty and unfaithfulness, attraction and refusal, seem to alternate frantically, like particles crashing into one another in an atom. This is A Sort of Tenderness, a podcast series from Cora Media, promoted by Palazzo Grassi, Pinel Collection, Venice. Open End, the great exhibition dedicated to Marlene Dumas at Palazzo Grassi, is the first great personal of the artist in Italy. There are two ways to enter Dumas' labyrinth of imagination, either running, galloping, or prowling like a leopard. This is the advice of the poet and writer Marlene van Niekerk, who shares both her first name and her country of birth with Marlene Dumas. Van Niekerk says that either galloping or prowling, it's still rare to catch the essence of Dumas' work, as it is often rough and unsteady, as if the color on the canvas were festering, infected, and bubbling. Marlene Dumas was born on the 3rd of August 1953 near the Kells River, a mostly rural area 25 kilometers from Cape Town in South Africa. Her mother, Helena, was a housewife, and her father, Johannes, a winemaker. The language used in the household was Afrikaans, a Creole dialect used by the descendants of the Dutch that had arrived in the 17th century, a unique language, mixing Dutch and Bantu, alongside other African dialects and Portuguese. The father passed away when Marlene was just 12 years old, and he used to work in the small vineyard of Jacobsdal, which the family owned from 1916.
I grew up on a farm. I grew up with a father making wine, and I climbed in the trees. Our two brothers, one 6 years older, one 9 years older, and actually I quite liked being a child. Didn't quite like so much going to school. That was something else, because then suddenly, I liked being alone on the farm But I don't really like to talk so much about school and that, because after my father died when I was 12, I went to a hostel in the town called Stellenbosch, which is a very Afrikaans place with all the professors and the university and stuff. And I grew up in Kuilsrivier, which was a one-horse town, a small place where you had one bar, one doctor, one of everything. Actually, still almost looks like that.
Still today, the Kells River and Jacobsdal are seen as very calm areas, where life follows the beat of farm work. The internet pictures show great green spaces and mountains off in the distance. This is the region of the Western Cape, the southmost part of the African continent. Looking at the pictures on a computer screen, the impression is that of an ancient and untouched land. However, according to Marlene van Niekerk, the poet and writer that called the world of Dumas a labyrinth of imagination, it wasn't so much nature, but the mental landscape of South Africa that truly influenced Marlene Dumas.
I would say one should rather focus on probably the moral or the ethical landscape of South Africa and take the question into the direction of the contested area known as South Africa. Even the name South Africa is contested. And it has always been a domain of questioning and a domain of contestation and challenge, being a former colony, now a post-colony, and the status of the contestation has not subsided. It's still going on. And I think growing up in a place like that for all sort of more or less sensitive South Africans, even those of the privileged classes like Marlene Dumas herself and myself belong to, even for us, it sensitized us and conscientized us, and I think created a very fine antenna or radar for ethical and moral questions and for the ambiguities of life, and also for the myths and illusions that people in such a situation grab onto for the sake of giving themselves a feeling of security.
However, what about the importance of the Afrikaans language and culture on the generation of Dumas and van Niekerk?
Afrikaans language and culture are also contested elements in that ambiguous landscape of South Africa. Afrikaans culture is to a large extent a construction. It was a construction under the Apartheid regime. The Afrikaans culture was meant to be by the political masters of the time as the culture of a Kulturvolk in the German sense of the word. And it had high ambitions for that cultural people through Eurocentric and very elitist ideas of art and music and so forth. And one has to understand that South Africa is a very isolated place down there, and this ambition in itself was just completely bonkers, and mad and crazy. So when I say Afrikaans language, one must remember that these things are at the back of Marlene Dumas' mind, also when she chooses English as the main vehicle of her ambiguous and ironical titling. So what I can say is that all Afrikaans children grew up with the Bible and with the kitsch pictures in the Bible. They didn't grow up with Caravaggio. They grew up with kitsch drawings of Christ on the cross, etc.
Around Kells River in the 50s and 60s, there wasn't much to do. You could go to the movies, for example, but films were often censored by a commission called the Directorate for Publications, and books were censored by another commission, the Actie Morele Standaard. The South African Republic wasn't a normal country. In 1948, 5 years before the birth of Marlene Dumas, a new government had proclaimed a segregation regime. The Apartheid divided between schools for blacks and for whites, hospitals for blacks and for whites. Mixed marriages were banned by the Immorality Amendment Act, and sex between blacks and whites became a crime. Black workers had to show a special pass to work in urban centers, and they were forced each night to return to the townships, which were areas at the margins of the city where the black majority lived. Here lived Makwina Modimola, who was born near Pretoria and today is the delivery manager at the Tambo School of Leadership.
I was born in 1969 in Mamelodi, a township 20 kilometers outside of the capital city of South Africa, Pretoria. Townships were reserved for black people who offered their labor to minority whites in the country. Obviously, life was very difficult. Firstly, people had no ownership of their homes. They had no title deeds, therefore became permanent tenants in their houses. I started school in 1975. The year after, I witnessed the revolt of 1976, which started in Soweto and spread to most townships in the country. There were lots of soldiers, police, killing, kidnapping, protesters. Most of them were school children, and many of them left the country to go to exile to fight for liberation of all of us. My parents, my father and mother, endured the most brutal time of apartheid, where any white person was your police. They could tell you when to get off the curb, they could tell you which shop you could go into, they could tell you what to buy, what not to buy, what time you should be in town, what type of work you should do. Now things have gotten better for most black people, although to remove a system that is entrenched for 300 years is not going to be easy.
As a child, Marlene Dumas bonded with a black woman that worked in her family home. They became very close, but despite this, they weren't allowed to eat or sit at the same table. There's a painting by Dumas on the first floor of the exhibition in Palazzo Grassi called The White Disease, and it shows a face that seems to be afflicted by a skin illness.
Yeah, The White Disease is a painting that I made in the 80s, and often when people speak about it, they talk about it as if it is only a reaction to apartheid. But I feel that the painting is of a much broader importance because, or relevance, because it actually addresses the, how can I say, the white problem in a broader sense too, because if you think of the Nazis, it wasn't only against the Jews, they were also discriminating against black people and thought they were that white was their color. And you have the Ku Klux Klan, etc., and it's still, as we know, it's a problem.
Even as a child, Dumas loved drawing and collecting photographs. In 1963, at just 10 years of age, she drew a truly vivid picture, similar to the others that Marlene used to create, using a packet of cigarettes as a support. In this case, Marlene depicted 10 Miss World contestants in bathing suits, some in profile, others not. Blondes, brunettes, redheads, with hairstyles like those of Elizabeth Taylor or Sophia Loren, the typical beehive styles of the 60s. Each bathing costume has a different style and cloth, with a different color or texture. The shapes are those of the pinups of the time. The entire recording of that evening is available online. It's quite striking to see participants from Colombia, Ceylon, Denmark, each walking on stage in the exact way that Dumas depicted them on a piece of paper. When I was young, Marlene Dumas writes in 1996, each Miss World looked alike. Chinese, black, Ghanese, or Japanese women just never managed to win. It was always only the typical white American that was considered the most attractive. Marlene's interest in drawing leads her down the path of art and expression. She attends the Cape Town School of Fine Art from 1972 to 1975, where she becomes interested in concept art, body art, and performance art. She starts painting in 1973. Her photography teacher, Dimitri Nicolas Fanourakis, introduces her to the work of Diane Arbus, a New York photographer who had committed suicide in 1971. Arbus had built her original career photographing eccentric characters. Women dressed like men and men dressed like women. Men with exaggerated ears, dwarfs, and circus performers. Marlene Dumas shares Diane Arbus's lack of judgment. Nicolas Fanorakis, her Cape Town teacher, once said that he appreciated his students' free-spirited way of looking, asking, indicating, questioning, mocking, risking, and joking. Dumas leaves South Africa for good in 76. She takes a plane across the cities and deserts of Africa, the Mediterranean Sea, and travels north to a different hemisphere, Amsterdam to be precise, where she still lives today.
When I finished my studies at the university in Cape Town, I applied for some bursaries, and then I got a 2-year bursary to study overseas. I didn't think I would get that, so I was totally surprised. And everyone at that stage, in terms of modern art, how we saw it, the place was New York. You know, France was for the old times, was for Picasso and those guys. But now if you wanted to go somewhere, you go to New York. That's how we all felt. But I was not ready for New York, and I also didn't really like the politics of America so much. But I specifically have to admit I was scared also of New York. And scared of the art world because I was not sure at all what I wanted to do. So I thought, let's start with Europe. And I thought because of the language, the Dutch language, that I would feel much more affinity with Holland. And they accepted me, and I thought, oh, thank goodness, so let's start there and see what happens. And when I got to the Netherlands, it was quite... I've never been away from South Africa. They thought I would get lost in the supermarkets.
In the 60s and 70s, Amsterdam becomes a progressive and liberal haven, where hippies from all over start to congregate. Amsterdam is the Magisch Centrum, the magical center of Europe. Culture and the arts are living a period of great change, just like the world itself is rapidly transforming. Artists like Gilbert and George are taking their first steps between the canals and bridges of the town. And in 1969, they put their own bodies on display at the Stedelijk Museum as living sculptures, dressed in jacket and tie with gold paint all over their faces. In 1976, the artist Sol LeWitt produces a work called Cut, which is simply a triangular cutout from a map of Amsterdam. Marlene Dumas enters the scene in 1976 at the age of 23.
What was wonderful also about the Dutch relation to art was that the painting was not so exciting, but they had Stanley Brown, they had all those guys, and Marina Abramovic, and the performance art. So, although that was not quite my thing, and they had all the porno. So I saw my first Deep Throat film, and South Africa had so much censorship on everything that in the beginning I didn't look at the art museums. I read all the books that was censored, and I saw the films that I could never see. So it was a very exciting time for me.
In that first period in Holland, Dumas attends the Atelier 63, an independent art school founded in Haarlem in 1963 and still active today. The school was the product of a group of artists, dissatisfied with academic teachings and searching for a more active and dynamic environment, where they could meet and exchange ideas.
Yeah, well, it was a mixture of things where, when I started to study at the Ateliers 63, that is how it was called in Haarlem then, I was a bit disappointed because indeed I wanted to see people like Pasolini or like Andy Warhol. I was young, I was 23, and so I wanted things that wasn't there really. But they sometimes seem to look down on South Africans as if because of the bad politics we were therefore not informed. But I felt that a lot of the Dutch painters around, some of the artists I found quite naive, and to admit so, I was a bit disappointed, but also in the end, it's not true that if I look at all the things that was there, it was actually wonderful to be here.
At the age of 25, Dumas brings her work to the Stedelijk Museum in an exhibition called Atelier 15, 10 Young Artists. Between 79 and 80, she also enrolls in the Faculty of Psychology, inspired by her thirst for knowledge, which went beyond the artistic field itself. The first works of Dumas are similar to conceptualism. They're experimental and often resemble collages or installations. For 5 years, from 1980 to 1985, she stops painting and focuses solely on drawing. In 1982, she takes part in the Kassel Documenta exhibition. She hangs out with the other active artists in Amsterdam, where there are just 2 great modern art galleries. Everybody knows everybody. They meet up in the same places and spend the night together. Dumas enjoys taking Polaroids of her friends as a personal way of keeping a diary. From one of these photographs comes De gele vingers van de kunstenaar, or the yellow fingers of the artist, a painting of 1985, which depicts an artist and friend of the time, René Daniels. Daniels is holding a cigarette between his fingers. His gaze is misty and ironic, and you can almost perceive the humming and decadent alcoholic atmosphere that went hand in hand with the life and rituals of each bohemian art environment. By 1984, Marlene Dumas is still not well known. She's invited to Australia, the Biennale of Sydney, where she exhibits alongside the promising and well-appreciated American artist Mike Kelly and the German Anselm Kiefer. These two are assigned ample room, while she's given a much smaller area, which, according to Dumas herself, pushes her to work and compete with even more determination. For Dumas, cloistering in an art studio and painting is a way to enter that labyrinth that Marlene van Niekerk talks about. It's an act of total immersion.
It's not a hobby, it's not like the pleasure of eating a good meal or so. For me, the ideal state, but the only state to make a good painting is to be actually so tense and so in the moment that if you are a surgeon and you are busy with a patient and someone will not ask you to think about babies or children or other nice things, they want you to be there 100% busy with your subject.
With 1985 comes a great exhibition. The poster is very impactful, a picture of a group of lemurs, those small primates with wide eyes, known for their beautiful sounds. The exhibition is called The Eyes of the Night Creatures. 11 large portraits, each in extreme close-up, mostly of friends or figures in the field, where the face somehow looms over the visitor. This is the moment in which Marlene Dumas' style and poetic finally comes to fruition as we know it. A strong focus on the expression of the face has led a few critics to see a connection between the painting of Dumas and the Dutch tradition of the tronies, a type of portrait popular in the 16th and 17th centuries, which focused heavily on physiognomy and the psychological traits of the face, often slave to its most radical pulses, pleasure, pain, ecstasy, and agony. A difference is that the paintings of the tronies were based on real people, in flesh and blood, farmers, jesters, and beggars, while Marlene Dumas paints alone in her studio, using movie stills, Polaroids, and cutouts from magazines as her models.
My studio is filled with newspaper clippings, with things that I haven't read, with images, and I have to be alone, and it has to be quiet and dark. I don't listen to music when I work. I'm a bit like a dog who can't find wants to lie down and can't find the right place.
You can almost hear the snipping of scissors in the quiet of the studio as she selects an image from the page, separates it, steals it from an old magazine or porno rag, thus whisking it away from everyday life to the artificial and imaginative land of painting. This is how some of the works that you can find in Palazzo Grassi came to be, such as Fingers, Blindfolded, Figure in a Landscape. The Visitor is from 1995, one of the over 100 exhibited works and one of Dumas' most spectacular and hypnotic. The canvas is large, 1 meter and 80 by 3. It shows 3 prostitutes, their backs towards us, suspensefully and watchfully looking at the opening of a room from which the client is about to enter. He is the visitor from the title of the work. Their bodies are subject to that male gaze, which has been discussed and analyzed in the last 50 years by philosophers and writers.
Male gaze is a concept that came out of 1960s feminism, which is about how the world, how culture, how ideology habitually objectifies women, makes women into consumable items. And we see this in day-to-day life, but we also see this throughout art history. So there's a way of making women something like a consumable reward to be depicted by men, to be owned by men, to be consumed by men. And I think there are all sorts of interesting ways of resisting that kind of gaze, making that kind of gaze visible, and offering alternatives of different sorts of gazes that might be more liberating for the woman encased in that body that is perpetually represented as meat, as marketable meat.
These are the words of one of the most original English writers of our time, Olivia Laing, collaborator to The Guardian and The New York Times. We asked Laing a comment both on The Visitor and that little drawing that Dumas made at the age of 10 from the pictures of the 1963 edition of Miss World.
I'm fascinated by this pairing. So one of these is a drawing made by Marlene Dumas when very young, and it seems to me to absolutely replicate the male gaze. These are Miss World models. They're in a lineup. Their bodies are bared. They're multiracial backgrounds. She's carefully written the countries that they come from underneath, and you get this sort of sense of the diversity of bodies that can be owned, objectified, bought, and then there's a sort of ironic twist to it. She's very young, but it still feels like it's kind of mocking that sort of display. It's a witty, tongue-in-cheek drawing. And then seeing that resurface in her mature vision of The Visitors, which to my mind is one of the most extraordinary paintings ever. It's absolutely stunning. What she does here is so interesting. The door is open, light is bleeding through, and the male gaze is about to arrive through that door. These women are lined up to be looked at, but we are pulled into a different gaze. We're behind them. Whose eyes are we looking through? Are we looking through the madam's eyes of this brothel? Are we looking in some sort of voyeuristic way? Are we another one of this group? So it makes us feel what it's like to be on the receiving end of that gaze. It makes us feel what it's like to have the anticipation of who's going to come through the door, what are they going to do, what kind of act is going to be committed. Is it going to be a violent act? Is it going to be an unpleasant act? Is it going to be a lucrative act? And I think it's magnificent how she draws you into that, this scene of, beauty and sensuality, but also real unease and real unpleasantness.
In the same room as The Visitor, we can also see Red Moon, a retelling of the myth of Ophelia. While on the wall of the previous room, there's a painting from a private collection. It's a small painting, just about 30 centimeters by 24. but it's striking for the emotional impact and the multiple symbolic levels that it manages to evoke. The title is Crucifixion, but in this case it isn't Jesus Christ on the cross, but that slimy little creature that's often kissed by a princess in fairy tales, a toad. In the next episode, we'll discuss the lagoon in Venice. We'll go up to the first and second floor of Palazzo Grassi to see up close Ophelia, the toad, and the over 100 works of Open End. A Sort of Tenderness is a podcast written by Ivan Carozzi and produced by Cora Media, brought to you by Palazzo Grassi, Pinau Collection, Venice. Narrated by John Vincent. Studio recordings by Francesco Ferrari for Frigo Studio. The sound engineer for the Amsterdam recordings is Daniel van de Poppe. The editing of the interviews is by Francesca Botenghi. The producers are Anna Nenna and Monia Donati. The original music and the sound design is from Lost Movie. Content supervisor, Sarah Poma.